Welcome to our new series featuring life in Anglo-Saxon England, inspired by the Netflix series The Last Kingdom and the series of novels by Bernard Cornwell, The Saxon Stories.
This subject of Saxon weaponry has been requested by Ryne, Lucy's husband. Like us, he's a huge fan of the series and wants to learn more about this unique time in history.
Many different weapons were created and used in Anglo-Saxon England between the 5th and the 11th centuries. They carried spears, axes, swords, and bows and arrows. Most soldiers fought on foot during the battles and wore helmets and carried shields made of wood. Some also wore chainmail.
The most common weapon was a spear, the most feared weapon was an axe, and the most precious weapon was a sword. It took many hours for a blacksmith to forge an iron sword into shape. They also carried knives.
Weapons also had symbolic value, having a strong connection to gender or social status. Weapons were also included as grave goods in the early Saxon burials. The vast majority of these weapons were buried in the graves of men, but they were also sometimes buried in the graves of women too.
The warfare and violence of the Vikings was often motivated and fueled by their beliefs in Norse religion, focusing on Thor and Odin, the gods of war and death. They often engaged in a disordered style of frenetic, furious fighting, known as berserkergang, leading them to be termed berserkers. This may have been further induced by the use of hallucinogenic mushrooms or by using copious amounts of alcohol.
Anglo-Saxon swords were made of iron and had two sharp blades, one on each side of the sword. There was a pommel at one end near the grip. The pommel helped balance the weight of the sword so it was easier to use. Below the grip there were guards to protect the hand.
The scabbard was typically made of wood or leather, and the inside was often lined with fleece or fur. The sword and scabbard were suspended from either a baldric on the shoulder or from a belt on the waist.
The weight of these swords, along with descriptions of them in literature like the Battle of Maldon, indicates they were used primarily for cutting and slashing rather than thrusting.
In Old English, the term for knife was seax.
It was what?
Seax. I'm not sure if I got the pronunciation right.
May or may not be how it's pronounced.
Just put it on the screen, Lucy. Just put it on the screen, then I won't need to say it.
Okay.
Seax.
Coming up now.
The knife was primarily used for domestic purposes, although it could be used in battle. Some warriors used a mid to large-sized knife instead of a sword. This had a unique length and single cutting edge, and typically had a long wood or occasionally iron handle.
The blades were sometimes decorated and sometimes contained inscriptions bearing the name of the owner or maker. The seax was kept in a leather sheath, the sheaths themselves sometimes being decorated with embossed designs and silver or bronze fittings. The sheath was belted to the carrier with the hilt on the right-hand side of the body.
Several examples of the Francisca or throwing axe have been found in England. Such weapons can be distinguished from domestic hand axes by the curved shape of their heads. The throwing axe was no longer in use by the 7th century, but it was later adopted again by the Vikings and entered back in use during the 8th and 9th centuries.
Spears were the most common weapons in Anglo-Saxon England. They consisted of an iron spearhead mounted on a wooden shaft, often made of ash wood. There was much diversity in the sizes and shapes of the spearhead. Sometimes they were decorated, with bronze and silver inlay placed on the blade and socket.
In battles, spears were used as missiles and as thrusting weapons during hand-to-hand combat. Barbed spears were used as missiles. Once the spearhead had penetrated an enemy's body, the barb caused much difficulty in removing the weapon, thus increasing the likelihood that the victim would die as a result of the wound. If the spearhead penetrated an enemy's shield, it would have been difficult to remove, thus rendering that shield heavy and difficult to use.
Anglo-Saxon arrowheads have been divided into three main types: leaf-shaped, bodkins, and barbed arrowheads.
The shield was another extremely common piece of war equipment used by the Anglo-Saxons. The shields comprised a circular piece of wood constructed from planks which had been glued together. At the centre of the shield, an iron boss was attached. It was common for shields to be covered in leather so as to hold the planks together.
Large shields were used in full-scale battles. Both sides would create a shield wall as a strong layer of defence. Smaller shields were lighter and easier to manoeuvre, and therefore were best used in minor skirmishes and hand-to-hand combat.
The Dig, starring Kerry Mulligan and Ralph Fiennes, tells the story of the discoveries made at Sutton Hoo near Woodbridge, Suffolk, in 1939. One cemetery has an undisturbed ship burial with a wealth of Anglo-Saxon artefacts.
Redwald of East Anglia is the most likely person to have been buried in the ship. The site is important in establishing the history of the Anglo-Saxon Kingdom of East Anglia, as well as illuminating the early Anglo-Saxon period, which lacked historical documentation.
We hope you found this subject as interesting and fascinating as we did when we researched it. If you've got any questions, please let us know, and we will research further and find out the answer for you.
And if you have a subject from Anglo-Saxon history that you want to know more about it, leave it in the comments section below. We'll be sure to include it in our series.
Thank you so much for watching. Please give us a like and subscribe to the channel.